Chapter 8, the Muscular System. Objective number 1. Let's locate in the body and compare the structures and functions of the three major types of muscle tissue. The three major types are skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. We'll go into each one of them a little bit further in the next couple of slides. Muscle tissue. And the reason we have muscle tissue is that it enables the body to move its different parts. So we mentioned before that we have three different kinds: skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. If you look at the previous slide, it'll show you what they look like underneath the microscope. Movement is caused by muscle cells, and what happens is there's a shortening or contracting of the muscle. The muscle movement occurs when chemical energy obtained from food is converted into mechanical energy. And right now I want to remind you to start memorizing your muscles, especially ones that are mentioned within the PowerPoint or the study guide. Cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle composes of the bulk of the muscle in the heart. It has fibers that are bunched together. They have a dark band called an intercalated disc. The fibers interconnects, allowing the heart to contract efficiently as one unit. It's an involuntary muscle or vascular muscle, and the cardiac muscle is striated. So when we look at how the different muscles are laid out, you would know that cardiac muscle is striated and involuntary. Smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is also an involuntary muscle. It is called non-striated, and it's a visceral muscle. It lacks cross stripes or striations, and when seen under the microscope, it appears to be smooth, so it's called smooth muscle. It's found in the walls of hollow structures, such as your digestive tract, your blood vessels, and so on. It also contractions of the smooth muscle are highly irregular. They promote food passage throughout the digestive tract. And when we talk about sphincters are a ring of muscle tissue that closes off openings in the body, and it is smooth, and most are involuntary. We're going to advance to skeletal muscle. Well, skeletal muscle is striated and voluntary, which means that we can move those muscles on our own. We can say, I want to move my arm here, and my arm will go there, because that's what the skeletal muscle does. Microscopically, we look at it, and it has stripes or striations. It's thread-like. It's got cylindrical, and it's in bunches. It is attached to the bone, and if you have a 120-pound person, about 50 pounds of that, comes from the skeletal muscle. And it is real important in keeping us upright, keeping our organs in the proper spot, protecting our brain, moving our head. Any movement that we have in our body that is on the outside is done by skeletal muscle. More about skeletal muscle. Mainly striated muscle fibers and connective tissue. Connective tissue forms the wraps around each of the muscle fibers and around the fascioles. which are the groups of muscle fibers, and around the entire muscle and nearby structures. Most skeletal muscle will extend from one bone across a joint to another bone. Okay, more about muscle organs. The regions of the skeletal muscle is divided into three parts. There's the origin, the insertion, and the body. The origin attaches to the bone that remains relatively stationary or fixed when movement at the joint occurs. The insertion is the point of attachment of the bone that moves when the muscle contracts. So the insertion is the hook to the bone that moves. And then the body is the section between the origin and the insertion. Muscles attach to the bone by tendons, and tendons are strong cords or sheets of connective tissue, and I'm going to line connective tissue, that extend from the muscle organ. Some tendons enclosed in synovial lining tubes, that's your tendon sheaths, and are lubricated by synovial fluid. Inflammation of the tendon sheath is called tenosynovitis. So break it down. Teno, tendon. Synovo is what? It's the synovial fluid, and itis is always inflammation. This condition causes pain and is usually due to repetitive movements. Since tendons facilitate movement, inflammation can cause lower activity. Here's more about bursa. Bursa is a small synovial lined sac containing a small amount of synovial fluid located between some tendons and underlying bones. Synovial membrane is the membrane that lines the bursa and secretes the synovial fluid. Next objective. Discuss the microscopic structure and function of the skeletal muscle, including a sarcomere and a motor unit. When we look at the structure of the muscle, we need to take into consideration what that muscle is going to do. So each muscle organ has many muscle fibers. During contraction, the thin filaments are pulled together towards the center of the sarcomere. Electronic microscopy shows the overlapping thin and thick filaments within each sarcomere, creating a pattern of dark striations in the muscle. Sarcomere is a basic functional part of contractile unit of the muscle, and it contains Z-line marks, which are at the end of the individual sarcomeres. Look at page 3. Look at the item on of 3-8-3 and see how it processes the sarcomere lines. It shows it the process where the sarcomere lines are pulled closer together. That is on page 158. Okay, let's talk about the microfibers that are within the muscle. So the structure of microfibers is on figure 8-3, and it looks at the contraction of the muscle fibers. Contractile cells are called muscle fibers. Connective tissue holds those muscle fibers in a parallel group. Fibers of the cytoskeleton form cylinders that contain thin microfilaments and thick microfilaments. Okay, thick microfilaments contain myosin, and thin microfilaments contain actin. So you need to remember the difference between these two and what they have for active agents. Okay, muscle fibers continued. The basic functional contractile unit is called the sarcomere, like we mentioned before. Sarcomeres separate from each other by dark bands called Z-lines. The sliding filament module explains mechanism of contraction. So when we look at a theory, and this theory is about the sliding filament model, and so what they're doing is they're giving us a solid hypothesis of what's exactly happening in the muscle. So the thin and thick microfibers slide past each other in a contraction. Contraction requires calcium and energy-rich ATP, adenosine triphosphate molecules. When the muscle relaxes, the sarcomeres can return to a resting length, and the filaments resume their resting position. The ability of a muscle to shorten and thicken is known as elasticity. Know that if you don't use a muscle, it will atrophy. So atrophy means that the muscle is deteriorating or wasting away. If you've ever seen somebody who had a cast on for an extended period of time, or a brace on for an extended period of time, or laid in bed for an extended period of time, you will see that those muscles have really deteriorated down to almost nothing. For that muscle to react, it needs to have a nerve impulse. So a nerve impulse travels to the muscular fiber through the through a motor neuron. So you could think of it, motor is movement. So this is a movement neuron. Impulses trigger the release of calcium ions. The calcium ion binds to the thin filaments and permits action to the reaction of myosin. So what happens is that the calcium binds with the myosin. The ability of a muscle to shorten and thicken and return to its original shape is called elasticity. Remember me mentioning that before. ATP is broken down, giving the energy for this process. I thought that this picture was a very good one to look at and see each individual movement that happens within that muscle tissue. So to repeat, the functions of the muscle are to produce movement, to give muscle tone by continuous tension on the muscle, on the skeletal muscle, and it maintains posture and position. It also produces body heat. And if you ever really wonder about this, go work out a little bit and use those muscles, and you will find that you will sweat because your body is producing heat. Now that we've looked at the molecular part of this muscle, let's look at the outside of this muscle. The muscle produces movement by pulling on a bone as the muscle contracts. So the insertion end pulls closer to the origin. Movement occurs at the joint between the origin and the insertion. So remember I was talking about the origin and insertion above? Well, this is the actual movement of that. When we break down the movement, the gross movement of the muscle, we break it down into what is the primary mover, what is the antagonist, and what is the synergist. So the primary mover is the muscle that has the major responsibility for a certain movement. The antagonist is the muscle that's opposite or reverse of the prime mover. And the synergist is a muscle that aids the primary mover in producing the motion, and this helps with rotation. Well, what's posture? Posture is a continuous low-strength muscle contraction called a tonic contraction, and it enables us to maintain our body position. Only a few of the muscle fibers shorten at one time, produces no movement of the body parts, maintains muscle tone called posture. Good posture favors best body function. Skeletal muscle tone maintains a good posture by contracting and pulling off of gravity. It fights against the pull of gravity. And gravity tends to pull the head and the trunk down and forward. Heat production. Heat production is there for a reason, and survival of the body depends on its ability to maintain homeostasis when it comes to body temperature. So your normal body temperature is 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 Fahrenheit. A fever, on the other hand, is an elevation of the body temperature, often with signs of illness. So if you have a temperature, usually that means an elevated temp usually means that you have a situation where you are either ill or you have been exposed to a lot of heat. Let's say you worked out putting blacktop on driveways or putting roofing on a house. That would up that temperature and cause a hyperthermia. So the body produces a homeostasis by what? Sweating, the loss of water, the dehydration of the water on the skin. Hypothermia, on the other hand, is a reduction of the body temperature. So, when would you get hypothermia? Well, most any elderly person that lives in a northern state, if they don't have heat in their house properly, will get hypothermia. There's every year I lived in Wisconsin, there was somebody in Michigan, in Milwaukee, that died of hypothermia because they didn't have heat in their house. So the body tries to keep that heat there, but if the environment continues to take off that heat, then the body goes into hypothermia and can and will die. Contraction of muscle fibers produces the most of the heat that is required to maintain normal body temperature. So if you're cold, you go outside in what you guys call winter here in Tennessee. If you're cold, you'll move around more. You'll rub your hands back and forth together. You'll jump up and down. Well, that produces that body heat to keep that body where it needs to for a temperature. Energy required to produce a muscle contraction is obtained from that ATP, which is your adenosine triphosphate. Sometimes the generation of ATP during heavy muscle use can produce too much heat, causing the body to sweat and to lower the body temperature. Fatigue. What happens in fatigue is that you have reduced strength for muscle contractions. It's caused by a repeated muscle stimulation without adequate periods of rest. So repeated muscular contractions deplete the cellular ATP stores and outstrips the ability of the blood supply to replenish oxygen and nutrients. Contraction is the absence of adequate oxygen producing lactic acid, which contributes to the muscle soreness. So during exercise, the store of ATP required for muscle contraction becomes depleted. Aerobic means required having oxygen. So if I talk about an aerobic exercise, it's an exercise that caused my muscle to need more oxygen. All right, more about fatigue. Oxygen debt. It's used to describe the metabolic effect required to burn excess lactic acid that may be accumulating during prolonged periods of exercise. Labored breathing after strenuous exercise is required to pay that debt back. So when you're breathing hard, it's the body trying to get enough oxygen in to replenish the oxygen that needs to be put into your muscles. The technical name for oxygen debt used by exercise pathologists is excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, EPOC. If repeated strenuous exercise occurs, not only does the strength of the contraction continue to decrease, but eventually the muscle loses its ability to contract itself. In the first couple of chapters, I told you that we divide our body up into body systems, but those body systems never work individually. There are other body systems that work with that body system. So we're going to look at what other body systems do we need when we come to movement. So it's going to interact with respiratory system, with the nervous system. So most muscles cause movement by pulling on bones across a movable joint. So if we had muscles and we didn't have bones, we still wouldn't have movement. So the skeletal system disorders, especially like arthritis, have disabling effects on the body movement, because if you've got chunks of bone in that joint that doesn't belong there, that joint is not going to move smoothly and painlessly. Now let's look at the respiratory tract and the circulatory system and the nervous system. They all need to work to help with the movement. So you need the respiratory system because it's going to bring in the oxygen. You need the circulatory system because it's going to deliver the oxygen to the tissue. You need the nervous system because the nervous system gives the message across. You need the muscle system to do the work, and you need the skeletal system to give it stability. So diseases like muscular sclerosis, a brain hemorrhage, spinal cord injuries, all are examples of pathological conditions that would affect these other body organs and would change our ability to move and be effective with it. Well, let's look what the neural system has to do with movement of muscles. So there's a unit called a motor unit. Motor meaning movement, okay? So motor units stimulate the muscle by a nerve impulse. And that nerve impulse is caused by neurotransmitters that signal the motor neuron to respond. to the impulse. Then the motor neuron is specialized nerve that transmits an impulse to a muscle causing contraction. So then when we look at this, we need to look at the neuromuscular junction. Well, neuromuscular junction is, let's break it down, neuro, nerve, muscle, muscular, junction. So we would know that this is a junction between the nerves and the muscles. And this is the point of contact between the nervous system and the muscle fiber. The motor unit combination of the motor neuron, motor units is a combination of motor neuron and muscular fiber, and the muscular fiber it controls. So when you look at a motor unit, the things that are in a motor unit is a single motor neuron and its muscles that it innervates. So we're talking about a single one. You're only talking about the single motor neuron and the muscle fibers it innervates. Innervates means that nerves go to it to work. All right, next objective. Discuss how a muscle is stimulated and compare the major types of skeletal muscle contractions. So we're going to talk about the different kinds of contractions that you're going to find in a muscle. Okay, muscle stimulus. A muscle can contract only, underlined, only if an applied stimulus reaches a certain level of intensity. So that is called a threshold stimulus. So that's the minimum level of stimulation required to cause a muscle fiber to contract. So once the stimulation has reached this threshold, a muscle fiber will contract completely, and this response is called all or nothing, or the all or none rule. Thinking back to the last slide, when it's all or nothing, you would think that all of your muscles work at one time and none of your muscles work at one time. Well, that is not true. You have different muscles and they each have a different threshold. So you have different muscle fibers in a muscle are controlled by different motor units having different thresholds. So although individual muscle fibers always respond to the all or nothing rule, to a threshold stimulus, the muscle as a whole doesn't. So if the whole muscle did an all or nothing, you'd slap yourself because your muscle wouldn't go smooth. It would just snap up or snap down. So having the individual fibers makes it so that you have smooth movement of your arms and legs. Okay, different motor neurons responding to different thresholds permit a muscle as a whole to execute contractions of a graded force. So what we're saying is that if you're going to pick up something, your muscles will respond differently. So the amount of stimulus is different to each part of the muscle, but the strength of the muscle or the strength of the movement is how many muscle fibers were stimulated by that motor neuron. So you've got all these motor neurons. If only a couple are stimulated, then you would have less strength in that movement. But if a whole bunch of them were stimulated, then you would have more strength with that movement. Over the next couple of slides, we're going to look at these different kind of contractions. The twitch contraction, the tectonic contraction, isotonic contraction, and the isometric contraction. Now, you've seen some of these before in previous chapters. You've not seen twitch contractions. Those twitch contractions are only a laboratory phenomenon. Now, it's not a normal muscle activity. They are single contraction of a muscle fiber by a single threshold stimulus. So those are only found in a lab setting. Tectonic contractions are sustained muscle contractions caused by the stimulus hitting a muscle in rapid succession. Here are another ones of the contractions. So, and you're going to need to know these, okay? Isotonic contractions. Isotonic contraction produces movement at a joint because the muscle lengthens. Okay, so an isotonic contraction, your muscle is lengthening. Now, or shortening. Now, the concentric contraction is the muscle shortens at the insertion end of the muscle to move towards the point of origin. The eccentric contraction is the muscle links under tension, thus moving the insertion away from the origin. Most types of muscle movements, walking, running, and so on, are produced by isotonic contractions. I think the last one we're going to talk about is isometric contractions. Isometric contractions are contractions that don't produce movement. Okay, the muscle size does not change. And although the muscle movement doesn't happen, tension within the muscle increases. You will find that there are people who work out that use isometric contractions. It is not the same as lifting weights. You won't see them moving. They will just be moving the muscle itself inside itself. So there's only tension on that muscle. It's not moving. You look real close at the pictures on your left-hand side. Look at isotonic contractions. Well, you have eccentric contraction. Now, that is where you have the movement is going from here to here. Okay, so the muscle is lengthening on eccentric. Concentric, on the other hand, look at how that one's going. It's going the opposite direction. And that is where the muscle has shortened to bring that ball up towards the core of the body to adduct it. Okay, so now let's look at isometric. Isometric, look at how it's on a solid bar. That bar does not move. That hand does not move. See the bar here? You don't have any movement. But look what happens to your muscle. They relax it, and then they contract it. So, isotonic, you have movement. Isometric, the muscle stays the same length. Next objective, list and explain the primary effects of exercise on the structure and function of skeletal muscle. Okay, if exercise is done regularly and properly practiced, it improves the muscle tone and posture. It results in a more efficient heart and lung function and reduces fatigue. Muscle changes in relation to the amount of work that they normally do. Prolonged inactivity causes disuse atrophy. Regular exercise increases the muscle size and causes hypertrophy. So I want you to look at two parts of those two words. Hyper would be what? More. Right? And the other one is going to be less. That's correct. So I want my muscles to hypertrophy, meaning I want them to get bigger. So strength training is the exercise involving contraction of muscles against heavy resistance. This is where you see the weightlifters. The pressing weights with your legs, lifting weights with your arms. So strength training increases the number of microfilaments in each muscle and results in a total body mass that's bigger, causing microscopic tears, which then develop scar tissue that results in increased muscle mass due to more tissue. So if you're going to go out and do strength training, know that it doesn't increase the number of muscle fibers, but it does increase the muscle mass. Endurance training. Well, the definition of endurance training is exercising that increases the muscle's ability to sustain moderate exercise over a long period of time. It is sometimes called aerobic training. So this allows more efficiency in delivery of the oxygen and nutrients to the muscle because it increases the blood flow to that muscle. It does not usually result in hypertrophy. So if you've got a runner, that runner's not going to usually look muscle bound unless they're doing something else to produce that muscle. But they will have endurance. They can go up and down and up and down, up and down stairs and not become short of breath. And what it does is the endurance training or aerobic training causes an increase in the number of mitochondria in muscle fibers. So this allows for more production of ATP as a rapid energy source. So let's say I want to be able to go for a 2-mile walk without becoming short of breath. I would participate in endurance training. I wouldn't do weightlifting because it's not going to give me the endurance that I need to go for a walk. So if I was getting ready for a marathon, I would want something that was repetitive exercise. Now that doesn't mean that I won't lift weights, but I'm going to do it in a repetitive fashion that is not stressing that muscle to rip it. I'm going to do stuff that is going to cause me to have the endurance to survive, anything that is long term. Like we do the world's longest yard sale. And we'd better have endurance or we're not going to make it through that day. Because you walk and then you walk and then you walk some more. Okay, the next part says, list and explain the most common types of movement produced by skeletal muscle. Okay, let's talk about the different kinds of movements that you're going to see. And on the next slide, we're going to see the body doing those movements. Okay, so angular movements are flexion and extension. Well, flexion decreases the angle. Extension increases the angle, and it is the opposite of flexion. Abduction moves something away from the midline of the body. Adduction adds it to the body, and it moves towards the middle. Circular movements are rotation, which it turns around an axis. Circumduction, which it moves the distal end of a part in a circle. So that's what we do with our shoulder if we're young. Supination and pronation. Supination, the hands positions that results from the twisting of a wrist. So you'll see on the next slide supination and pronation of the wrist. Okay, let's look at some special movements of the body that I mentioned that we were going to be looking at in the previous slide. So dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. In dorsiflexion, the ankle, in plantar flexion, the ankle movement is upward and downward. So that's how you move your foot. So dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. Then inversion and eversion moves the ankle from side to side. Okay, this example is in your book. It's figure 8-7. And it shows the flexion of an arm, the extension of an arm, and see how in the middle it shows the movement. And this is a leg. So if we have extension, that leg is straight. If we have flexion, that's what we do when we sit in a chair, is we flex our leg to a 90-degree angle to be able to sit in a chair, unless you're in a recliner. Then you have extension. Here are some more examples of the movements of the body. Look how there's an angular movement with flexion and extension. And then look at the other angular movement, which is abduction and adduction. You can see this young man moving his hand in towards his body or away from his body. Then when we look at the hand, which is number E, E shows that your hand, if it is in an anatomical position, you will find that the hand is positioned facing up. So pronation means that you're rotating the hand, rotation of the hand, so that the palm are facing downward. So your anatomical position is where your palms are facing what way? They're facing up. As you study the illustrations of the previous slide, you should attempt to group them together according to their function, because you'll see within this course over and over that form equals function. The last one is you need to be able to, I do believe it's the fast one, name, identify on a model or diagram, and give the function of the major muscles of the body discussed in this chapter. Okay, let's take a look at some of the muscle groups. So let's start with the head, because that's usually the best place to start. And you have facial muscles, and you have neck muscles. Well, the facial muscles are like your obiculus oculi, obiculus oris, which is your kissing muscle. That's the one that puckers your lips. And the zygomaticus, which is your smiling muscle, and it elevates the sides of your mouth. And you, it's also, we'll talk about muscles that for mastication. Well, mastication is what you do to your food when you chew it. So whenever we talk about mastication, we're talking about the chewing, the breakdown, mechanical breakdown of food within the mouth. So we have the master, which elevates the mandible, and we have the temporal muscle, which closes the jaw. So those two work together to cause mastication. The sternocleidomastoid relaxes the head. The trapezius elevates the shoulders and extends the head. Okay, this is a nice picture of where everything is. So contraction of the frontal muscle allows you to raise your eyebrows. The two sternomastoid muscles are located on the anterior surface of the neck. So look down and you'll see that the sternomastoid muscle is the one that goes right around your neck on the sides. So let's talk about the muscles of your upper extremities. They originate from structures over the lower back. So you have the pectoris major and the latissimus dorsi, and that the pectoris major flexes your muscles, flexes your arm. That's the one you see the young boys trying to make muscles with. That's what they're doing. The latissimus dorsi extends the arm. Then there's the deltoid, and the deltoid abducts the arm. And the deltoid is the muscle that you'll be giving IM injections in the arm, into that muscle. The biceps brachii, that relaxes the forearm. It's a two-headed muscle that serves as the primary flexor of the upper arm. The triceps brachii, which extends the forearm. Muscles of the trunk of the body. So these are your abdominal muscles. There's the rectus abdominis. Now, it runs down the middle of the abdomen from the thorax to the pelvis. And it's important because without it, we could not bend over. And our body organs would fall out. So we really would want that to have, to be there and to be strong. The external obliques are the outer layer of the anterior lateral abdominal wall. The internal obliques are the ones that are internal, so those are closer to the center. And the transverse abdominis, abdominis is the one. Transverse usually means kitty corner, okay? And then you also have in that abdomen intercostal muscles. That's the muscles between the ribs. Remember I was saying costal meant rib? Well, this is the muscle between the ribs. And then there's the muscle that's the diaphragm. The diaphragm is between the thorax and the abdomen. So it's another muscle that's in there. Okay, so this is the rectus abdominis. See how it's right down the middle, right down here. And then you have your external obliques. See how they're external? They're on the outer side. Then you have your umbilicus, which is your belly button. And you have your internal obliques. See how those are obliques, but they are going towards the middle. Then you have the latissimus dorsi. This is your muscle that's right here in the middle of the outside here. And the pectoris major, that's the one that the weightlifters like to make themselves really big. Okay, like if you looked at, I don't know who's the most recent weightlifter, but Arnold Schwarzenegger was from my era, and that's the muscle he would build up. Then the transverse abdominals, those are the ones that go across, like they go across this way. Okay. Now we're going to look at the muscle groups that move the lower extremities. The ellipsis, it flexes the thigh. It originates from deep within the pelvis and the lower vertebrae. And then you have the sartorius. Now the sartorius permits your legs to be crossed. So it's the one that you can thank when you go to cross your legs. It's doing its job. The gluteus maximus it extends the thigh and it gives the buttocks its contour. Then there is the adductor muscles, and that adducts the thigh, so that brings it back into the body. You have hamstring muscles, which are semimembranosus and semitendinosus, and your bicep femoris. More muscles related to the lower extremity. So you've got quadricep femoris group, which is your extended lower leg. So you've got the rectus femoris and the vastus muscles. Now the vastus muscles is where you're going to get shots in your leg. The trabeculus anterior is what dorsal flexes your leg. The gastromenimus does your plantar flexion of your leg. The perinosis group is the one that flexes the foot. It's a group of 3 muscles found along the side of the leg and is also known as the forbillaris group. Then you have the gastrocnemius, which inserts through the calcaneus, which is your Achilles tendon. This is your tendon that goes down the back of your leg into the heel, which is your calcaneus, and it is responsible for plantar flexion of the foot. Alrighty. Now I'm going to show you where you're going to get shots. So you have, for places to give shots, your gluteus maximus, see right there. And you have your, where are they? Vastus lateralis, which is right there. And you have your deltoid right there. Now, when it comes to your gluteus maximus, you will find that you're going to put it, their shot doesn't go right in the middle of here. It goes more to the side, like right in here. Please don't forget to bring questions to the discussion for this chapter, and feel free to email me or message me on Team. It's probably best to message me on Team because other people can see your answers.